In this video, we're going to be building out a Next.js application that implements magic link authentication, as well as authorization, route controls, protected routes, and redirects, both on the client as well as the server. Now, the way that we are going to do this is with Supabase, and one of the reasons I like Supabase is that it offers not only the data and file storage, it also offers a wide variety of authentication mechanisms. And one of the ones I like the most these days is Magic Link, because Magic Link allows you to only hand over your email address, and you can not have to deal with a password. You can automatically be authenticated anytime you need to by just entering your email address. And it's a pretty secure way of dealing with authentication. But also, it offers the user multiple types of authentication. So you typically would say, hey, you can do Magic Link, or you can OAuth with Google or something like that, or you can enter your email and password. So this is kind of a good way to kind of give the user multiple different options. And or you could just offer Magic Link as the only way. I've definitely used applications that offer that. And we're going to be building out not only the client side redirects and things like that, but like I mentioned, we're going to be doing that in get server side props, doing SSR or server side rendering. And the way that we're going to do that is that Supabase, the client library, offers some SSR APIs that we're going to be working with. So the idea here is we want to build out a few different pages. We want to have a navigation. We want to toggle navigation items based on the user's authentication state. We want to be able to fetch the user's identity not only from local storage, but also from the cookie. And that way we can deal with authorization scenarios, not only on the client, but also in API routes or in the server rendered pages. So combining all this stuff is really powerful. It's really useful. It's actually a lot of fun. So with that being said, let's go ahead and start building this thing out. So the first thing we'll do is we'll go ahead and create our Next.js app using npx. We'll go ahead and change into this directory, and we'll go ahead and install our only dependency, either using npm or yarn. And that dependency is at Supabase/Supabase-JS. And this is the Supabase JavaScript client library, or the JavaScript library in general that we will also be using on the server. All right, so now that we've created our project, let's go ahead and open this up in our text editor. All right, so the first thing we want to do is we need to configure our Supabase API endpoint as well as our API key. So the way that we're going to do that is we're going to be using environment variables. And in Next.js, we can actually have these done in a .env.local file. And if we want to make these available on the client, we can also append the API key or whatever environment variables that we want to work with next public. So we're going to go ahead and create a couple of lines for boilerplate for now until we actually create our application in the Supabase UI. Here we see that we have next public Supabase URL. This will be our API endpoint. And then we have our next Supabase anon key, and this will be our public API key. So to go ahead and create those, we'll go ahead to go to app.supabase.io, and here you should go ahead and either be signed in or go ahead and create an account. And we're going to go ahead and click Create New Project. And here I'll go ahead and give this project a name. So we'll call this maybe Next Auth. And I will set a password and click Create New Project. Once the project's been created, we should be able to go here to Settings, and we can go to API, and here we can get our API URL as well as our API key. So I'm going to go ahead and copy the API URL and paste it here, and the same with the API key. And now we're ready to go. We don't really need anything else from our Supabase user interface. So we'll go ahead and save this, and we can now access these environment variables using process.env. And we're going to need to create a mechanism for us to kind of interact with Supabase. So to do that, let's go ahead and create a file called client.js. And this is going to be where we create our Supabase client. So the first thing we'll do is we'll import the create client from Supabase.js. And then we'll go ahead and create an instance of the client by calling it Supabase and passing in the first argument as the URL, API URL, and the second argument as the API key. So we have Supabase, and we're going to say create client. The first argument, like I mentioned, is the URL, and the second argument is the API key. And then we can now just export this, and then anytime we need to interact with Supabase, we can just import this from our client. Now, the next thing we might want to do is think about like our different pages that we're going to have. Right now we have an index page and we have an app.js. A lot of times you'll use app.js to do project-wide configurations for UI. So in this case, a navigation will make sense here. We'll do that, as well as set up an event listener, and from here we can kind of listen for different authentication events as well as other things. But to start off, let's go back to index.js and just kind of like get rid of a lot of this code here. We don't need most of it. We just want to kind of have like a basic landing page, I would say. So I'm just going to get rid of pretty much everything except for this main div, or this main component. And here we can just say hello world or whatever you want to do. But either way, we're just kind of like trying to make this a little bit more concise, because this is just going to be kind of the entry point. We're going to now have a couple of other routes. One is going to be a protected route that is protected on the server. We're going to have a profile view, and then we're going to have a sign in view. So the user can like sign in there, and we'll show and hide that based on the authentication state. So to do that, let's go ahead and create that page. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new page called signin.js. And here we can go ahead and start writing some code. So the first thing I'm going to import is use state from React. We know that we're going to need to deal with the state of the UI. So we're going to basically show a form for them to enter their email address. And then after they've entered their email address, we're going to kind of show them a message and hide the form. And we're going to say, hey, go and check your email. We'll import the basic styles that came with Next.js. And then we're going to import our Supabase client. And then we'll go ahead and create a function. This will be the sign in component. And we'll go ahead and create a couple of pieces of initial state. There's Copilot going wild there. We don't need any of that. So here we're going to go ahead and have a state variable called email. This is going to be the email address. So it's going to be a string. So we're setting the default to an empty string. And then as the user types, we're going to update the email address for that user. So we're going to attach this to a text input, and as they type in their email address, we're just going to keep that available locally. And then when the user submits the form, we send that to Supabase. We also have a submitted Boolean, and we're going to basically keep up with this. So after they've submitted the form, we're going to set that to true, and then we're going to toggle some UI. We're going to have a function called signin. Signin is going to call supabase.auth.signin, passing in the email address that the user has set. And one thing we might do here, if we want to have some basic form validation, we can say if email is not there, we'll return, or something like that. This is just really basic stuff, like to make sure that they've actually not left the input empty. Well, when they're signing in, this is going to be the magic link. This is going to kind of send them an email. So we're not passing in any password or anything like that. We're just sending the email. If this error is out, we're just going to log out the error. And if not, we're going to set the submitted Boolean to true. And then this way we can now toggle some UI right here. So we can say if the form has been submitted, we want to give them a message that says, please check your email to sign in, because they should have the magic link. And if it is not submitted, then we want to return our main user interface, which is basically just going to be a div wrapping an h1 that says sign in, and then we have our input here that says set email when they're typing. So we're going to say the on change event is going to be passing in the event.target.value, which is going to be the value of the form input, and we're going to call set email, which is going to update the email address set in the local state here. So with this, we are basically done with the sign-in component. This is all we really need to kind of make this work. So it's pretty concise amount of code, I would say, for a sign-in view, even though there's no styling there, of course. So the next page we might want to create is the actual profile view. So we want to have a way for users to kind of view their profile information once they're signed in. So the first three imports that we're going to go ahead and import are going to be useState and useEffect from React. UseEffect is going to be a way for us to kind of invoke some function when the application loads. And then useState, we're going to use to keep up with some local state. We're going to import the Supabase client that we created. And then we're also going to import useRouter from Next.router. And this is a way for us to do some client-side routing. So what we want to basically do is redirect the user if we have some, condition that requires us to do the redirect. So in our case, we might basically say, like, if they're not signed in, we can't show them the profile, so let's redirect them to sign in. And if they are signed in, we're not going to redirect them at all. All right, so our component we'll call profile. And profile is going to have one piece of state. It's going to have the profile. So by default, if there's not going to be a profile, we'll set it to null, and then we'll have a set profile function that will allow us to update that boolean, or that value, in this case null. And then we can say, like, if there is no profile, we'll return null. And then if there is a profile, we'll return our UI right here, which will be something we do in just a moment. All right, so the next thing we want to do is create an instance of the router. And in just a moment, we're going to set up a function that fetches the user's profile. And then we can say router.push if we want to redirect them. So we need to go ahead and have an instance of a router. And then in the useEffect hook, we can invoke that fetch profile function that we're just going to create in just a moment. So when the component loads, or when this route loads, we're going to call fetch profile. So let's go ahead and create a function here called fetch profile. And this is what we're gonna now do to interact with the user's profile. And the way that we can get the user's profile is we can call supabase.auth.user, and this will return null if there is no signed-in user, and if there is a signed-in user, it will return that profile. And then what we can do with this is we can say, like, if there's profile data, we'll do one thing, else we'll do something else. So what we might want to do is we'll say if there is no profile data, we want to say router.push. And we'll redirect them to sign in. And if there is a profile, we can now just call set profile, passing in the profile data. And then in our user interface, we now have access to that user's profile data, and we can render that to the screen. Of course, with Magic Link, by default, the only profile information that we're going to have is going to be basically their email address as well as their user ID. So that's the only thing that we're going to be returning. All right, so we'll create a div, and here I'm just kind of giving some basic styling so we can kind of center everything. So I'm saying a max width of 420 pixels, a margin of 96 pixels, and then automatic. So this is basically going to center the UI. And what we basically now want to do is we might want to go ahead and return or render out different pieces of their profile information. So we have the profile, and we're going to be rendering the profile email address as well as the profile ID. So having this is basically going to kind of like have a way for us to show their basic information. And then later on, you might even have a way to kind of update metadata or different attributes about the user. And then the last thing we might want to do is have like a button for signing out. And for signing out, we want to basically, not only remove the authentication session locally, but we want to maybe redirect them. We can use the router to do that as well. So let's create this sign out function. And for sign out, we'll call supabase.auth.signout. And it looks like it's already writing some of this stuff for us with Copilot. So yeah, we await supabase.auth.signout, and then we call router.push/sign-in. So that should be about it. This is a decently basic profile view, and we did this in like 33 lines of code, or really like could have been less than that. But basically the idea here is like when the component loads, we check their profile. If it exists, we render that here, and if not, we redirect them. So pretty basic stuff, but really, core fundamental ideas here as far as like writing different types of applications that you've probably written in the past or that you will write in the future. Now, the next thing we want to do is we want to basically create our app component, the _app.js that does a lot of different things. It renders our navigation, but one of the things it also does is that it will, when the app loads, it will go ahead and check to see if a user is there, and it will go ahead and set some information locally for us to use. It will also provide a listener, so when the user signs in or when the user signs out, we can do a set of functionality. Now, the functionality that we want here is to set the server-side cookie, because right now we're able to fetch the user information using the Supabase auth client, and this is checking local storage. But we also want to set this in the cookie storage as well. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to have a listener that listens for when the user signs in or when they sign out, and we're going to go ahead and call some API endpoint that we create. So for us to call that, we need to go ahead and create that API endpoint. So let's go ahead and go into Pages and create a new file called auth.js. And this is going to be a pretty basic function that allows us to handle setting the cookie, creating and removing it. So to do that, we first need to import the Supabase client, and this is going up 2 folders now because we're down here in Pages/API. So I'm going up to API and then above Pages down to here and grabbing the client. And then for the function that we're going to be dealing with here, it's going to only be calling supabase.auth.api.setAuthCookie. This is a helper function provided by Supabase that allows us to go ahead and set and clear the cookie. And this is going to be a function that we call from the main _app.js page that we're going to go ahead and write now. So let's go back to app.js, and I'll go ahead and close out some of these other files. All right. So we're going to go ahead and need a few more imports. So in addition to styles, we're going to go ahead and import useEffect and useState. We're going to import the link from Next.link, and this is what we're going to be using for creating our navigation links. We're going to import Supabase client as well as use router, and these are the 2 things we've been using in a few of our other pages. Instead of just returning the component, let's go ahead and return like a div and then the component here, because we're going to be needing to deal with our navigation in just a moment. And to make that work, we're going to need to have a parent component. So we'll go ahead and just maybe create that basic nav here, and then in a moment we're going to go ahead and write that out. Now for our local state, the only thing that we're really going to need is going to be a way to keep up with the authenticated state. And the reason that we're doing this is that we want to be able to show and hide navigation based on the user's authenticated state. So if they're authenticated, we might want to hide the sign-in link. And if they're not authenticated, we might want to show the sign-in link. So that's just kind of a basic example of how you might deal with UI based on the user's authentication state. The next thing we'll do is we'll go ahead and create an instance of the router because we're going to be needing that later. And then we'll go ahead and create our use effect hook. Okay, so in use effect, this is going to be interesting because this is where we're going to go ahead and set up our listener. So Supabase auth has an on auth state change event that we can listen to, and we can set that up here. And I'll go ahead and drop this code here, and we're going to go ahead and take a look at it. So here we're creating a variable called auth listener. And we're basically, subscribing to a listener. And then when the component cleans up, we go ahead and unsubscribe from that listener. So this will go ahead and fire anytime the auth state change event happens. And this will pass in the event in the session. And the event is going to be a string. So the event will be something like signed in or signed out. And then based on that event information, we can go ahead and do different things. So in this case, we're going to go ahead and basically set the authenticated state. And in this case, we're setting the authenticated state to authenticated if they're signed in. And then if they're not authenticated, we're setting it as not authenticated. Or if they're signed out, we're setting it as not authenticated. And this way we can basically, show and hide that UI state based on that. And if they are signed in, we're going to go ahead and reroute them to the profile page. Now, the reason that we're going to be rerouting them in this case is that the only time this event is going to fire is going to be if this authentication event happens. It's not just going to happen if they land on this page. This will happen, though, if they get rerouted from the magic link. So when they get rerouted to the application, this event will fire, and then we're going to go ahead and navigate them to the profile. If they come back to any page in the application, of course, this is set up in _app.js, so it's kind of like a global, then nothing is going to happen. Another thing that we do is that we're calling this handle auth change function that we've yet to create, and this function is going to be calling our auth.js handler. So this is going to be kind of setting that. So in a moment, we're going to create a function called handle auth change, and this will take in the event in the session, and it will go ahead and kind of like set that. And then the last thing we have going on here is a check user function. So the reason we have this function is in a second we're going to create it, but when the application loads, we want to go ahead and see if the user is authenticated, and then we're going to be basically doing this right here where we're calling set authenticated state, showing and hiding the user's authentication state. So let's go ahead and first create check user. This is a pretty basic function, and check user, like I mentioned, is just going to go ahead and set the authenticated state if the user is authenticated. So when we load this, they are set as not authenticated, and when the component loads, we're going to go ahead and check to see if the user exists, if they are signed in, and if they are, we're going to go ahead and set that. Again, the reason we're doing that is we're going to be hiding and showing the sign-in link in the actual user interface. And then the last function that we want to deal with is this handle auth change function. So let's go ahead and create that function here. Whoops. So handle auth change is going to be taking in the event in the session. And basically what we want to do is we want to interact with pages/API/auth. So the way that we can do that is we can just say fetch using the built-in fetch API, and we can send a post method, and the values that we're sending in as the body is going to be the event in the session. And then the auth handler will be able to deal with that using the requests and the response that's passed in the API endpoint. So we're calling fetch/API/auth. We're setting some basic headers, application JSON. We're setting the credentials the same origin since we're sending this from within the application, and then we're passing in the body. And now anytime we call handle auth state change, we can set that cookie, meaning when someone is signed in, we will be setting it, and then when they're signed out, we'll be removing it. So the event will be signed out, and the session will be null or empty. So, adding, removing the session based or the cookie based on the user's authentication state. All right, so let's go ahead and build out the navigation. And we're going to create some basic styling here. I'll create some styling called nav style. And we'll go ahead and create some margin here. And this will basically, make sure our nav isn't like pushed up to the very top of our UI. And then we want to create a couple of links. So the first two links that we'll create are going to be for home. And the home link is going to just navigate to the root of the application. And then we have a link for profile, and the profile is going to link to the profile component that we created just a moment ago. And then for the link style, we'll create something basic where we basically have a margin right of 10. And this is just so that the links are not squished together. So we're not doing a lot of like interesting styling here. We're just doing some pretty basic styling. What we might want to now do is now that we have this authenticated state, we can basically say if the authenticated state is equal to something like not authenticated, we might want to go ahead and show the link for signing in, because that means if they are not signed in, that not authenticated should be the state. So if the authenticated state is equal to not signed in, not authenticated, we're going to show this sign in link. And if they are signed in, then this link will not be visible. And then the last thing that we're going to create a link for is the protected route. And this is the route that we haven't yet created, but we're going to create in just a moment. And protected is going to be where we are actually calling the API here and dealing with the cookie, or we're going to be using the cookie that was set from this API route that we created earlier actually, and being able to kind of retrieve that cookie. And if that is there, then we're able to kind of do some server-side authorization. So we have this /protected route, and this will be something that we're kind of doing a similar thing to where we did with the redirect and the profile component, but this is going to be done on the server. And the last thing we need to do to kind of test this out is create protected.js. And this is going to be our protected route. And the only import really we're going to need here is Supabase client. And in this component, we're going to be using the get server-side props function that we haven't used anywhere yet. So we'll set that up now here. So we have our function profile, and then we also want to say export function get server-side props. And get server-side props is where we're going to kind of be doing most of the work here. Not really a whole lot going on in the actual UI here. So all we're really going to return is hello from protected route. And then the only way that they should be able to view this is if they are signed in. So if they're not signed in, of course, they should not be able to view that. All right, so let's go ahead and write the functionality that we're going to need in get server-side props. So here we're going to call supabase.auth.api.getUser by cookie. And this is how we're interacting with the cookie. This is kind of like a built-in piece of functionality provided by the Supabase client library. And all you need to pass in is the request. And if there is a user, then it will be available. If not, this will be empty or null. So we can basically redirect the user if there is no user, or we can redirect the request if there is no user. So we're going to say if there is no user, we want to say redirect, and then the destination is going to be /sign-in, because that's kind of what we want to send them if they're not signed in, to sign in. And if they are there, we can go ahead and pass in the user, or we can do something with the user. Like you probably wouldn't just pass in the user here. You might say do something with the user. But in our case, we're going to be just passing it in maybe just for this example. So maybe we'll say, let's go ahead and have the user. We'll just console.log the user information here. And I think that's about it. So the last thing we need to do is like actually test this thing out. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to say npm run dev. All right, so we'll go ahead and open our browser. We'll go to localhost 3000. Let's see if this works. Cool, so there is our application. It seems to be working so far. I'm gonna go ahead and open my console for the things that we're gonna be logging out. Let's zoom in a little bit. So we have our profile, and if we click there, we get redirected, which is what we expect. If we go to sign in, of course, we're already here. Now, if we click on protected, we should not be seeing any change because this is the reroute that is going to be checking to see if that cookie exists. And of course, it doesn't exist. So let's go ahead and try to sign in. So to do that, I'll go to email, enter my email address. And now we see that we're told to check our email to sign in. So I'll go ahead and check my email in a separate window. All right, I see my magic link here. So I'm gonna go ahead and copy the link address and then just paste it here. If you click that, it should automatically open up for you. And now we see that we are signed in. So here we see that we have our email address as well as our user ID. And if I open to inspect again, I should see that if I go to protected, that I'm able to view the protected route and I have my user information here. And if I go to my profile and I sign out, then my navigation updates and I'm no longer able to view the protected route. So that's about it for this video. Kind of wanted to run through this. It was a fairly short video, fairly fast. All of the code though for this project is linked below. And there's also a tutorial linked below that kind of walks through everything that we went through today. Hope you learned something. I had a lot of fun. I like building out this sort of thing. So thanks for checking this out. And until next time, I will see you around. Thank you.